Choose now, Veron, or watch the final spark of the terrestrial world vanish into the absolute darkness of the ocean floor. A jagged shard of rusted iron pressed hard against Veron's throat, held by a creature whose face matched his own in every horrific, symmetrical detail. The tide was rushing into the submerged chamber of the central spire, bubbling with a toxic, emerald luminescence that hissed as it touched the cold stone. If Veron turned the monolithic brass key to seal the vault, the surface kingdoms would be saved from the rising deluge, but his trapped twin brother would drown in the lower chambers. If he pulled his brother to safety, the oceanic breach would widen, and the ravenous sea would consume the last dry continents of the world. The identical face smiling back at him in the dim light offered no mercy, only the crushing weight of an impossible ultimatum. To understand the madness of the rising depths, Veron had to trust the ancient charts of the ocean cartographers, records that had guided his family for 5 generations. The grand archive of the sunken spire housed thousands of parchment scrolls, each detailing the topography of the abyss. As Veron bound his wound, his fingers brushed against the brass casing of his compass, an instrument that never pointed north, but rather toward the deepest thermal vents. His identical reflection in the polished glass of the instrument seemed to shift, a subtle distortion that he dismissed as a trick of the flickering whale oil lamps. He remembered the strange, rhythmic thumping that echoed through the stone floors during the lunar eclipse, a sound like a massive, mechanical heart beating deep beneath the crust. The scholars of the Coastal Alliance had always maintained that the deep ocean trenches were barren voids, devoid of intelligent life or ancient architecture. Yet, as Veron examined the continental shelf maps, he noticed peculiar geometric anomalies along the margins of the underwater canyons. These lines did not resemble natural rock formations, they were perfectly straight, intersecting at precise angles that suggested a massive, submerged network of walls. The cartographers of old had labeled these regions with warnings of phantom currents, but Veron suspected something far more deliberate was hiding beneath the waves. The air in the study grew heavy with the scent of brine and ozone, and outside the reinforced glass windows, the dark water seemed to pulse with a faint, synchronized energy. The key to salvation lay within the mechanical blueprint of the Great Siphon, an ancient subterranean engine built by a forgotten civilization to regulate the global sea levels. Veron memorized the intricate diagrams, noting how the main valve required a dual activation sequence from 2 separate control terminals located on opposite sides of the abyssal chasm. He knew his brother, Kalen, was already descending toward the secondary terminal, carrying the sister key forged from the same volcanic alloy. A sudden tremor shook the archive, causing several heavy inkwells to shatter on the floor, the black liquid spreading across the stone like the encroaching tide. Veron gathered his gear, ignoring the persistent sense of unease that told him the geometry of the maps was changing even as he looked at them. The descent into the lower trenches was a journey through a vertical desert of midnight blue and absolute black. Veron navigated the narrow catwalks of the outer spire, his heavy copper diving suit clanking against the wet iron grates. Below him, the abyss stretched out like an open mouth, illuminated only by the occasional flash of bioluminescent jellyfish that drifted past the structural columns. He could hear the muffled roar of the ocean pressing against the ancient masonry, a constant, terrifying reminder of the millions of tons of water suspended above his head. The pressure inside his helmet increased, forcing him to breathe in slow, measured gasps as he descended deeper into the watery underworld. Halfway down the abyssal stairs, Veron encountered the first Guardian monument, a colossal statue carved from a single block of dark basalt. The figure depicted a faceless mariner holding an hourglass filled with glowing green sand, the very sand that powered the ancient siphon engines. As Veron passed the monument, he noticed that the stone surface was covered in fresh, wet moss that seemed to grow at an impossible speed under the pressure of the deep. He reached out to touch the inscription at the base, deciphering the ancient glyphs that warned of a mirror that reflects the sins of the surface world. The word sent a chill down his spine, hinting at a historical betrayal that the coastal kingdoms had long sought to erase from their libraries. A sudden rupture in the primary pressure conduit sent a jet of superheated steam scalding through the corridor, forcing Veron to dive into a side alcove for safety. The metal walls groaned under the sudden shift in equilibrium, and the sound of tearing iron echoed through the dark tunnels. Veron checked his pressure gauges, watching the needles flicker violently toward the danger zone as the structural integrity of the sector began to fail. He had to find a way around the ruptured pipe before the entire corridor collapsed and cut off his access to the central vault. Time was running out, and the rhythmic thumping of the mechanical heart below was growing faster, mimicking the frantic pace of his own pulse. Through the thick glass of his observation portal, Veron saw the secondary control tower across the chasm, its lights flickering weakly against the dark water. He could see a figure moving inside the glass dome, the distinct silhouette of Kalen working frantically at the secondary terminal to stabilize the pressure grid. Veron radioed his brother through the acoustic copper tubes, his voice sounding hollow and distorted by the immense depth. Kalen answered, his words broken by static, reporting that the emergency subvalves were jammed with crystalline salt deposits and required a massive manual override. They had to synchronize their actions perfectly, or the imbalance would tear the entire network of spires apart from the inside out. As Veron reached the central junction, he discovered that the main water column had already breached the upper bulkheads, creating a roaring waterfall of saltwater that plunged into the depths. The force of the torrent created a powerful vacuum, pulling loose debris and ancient scrolls into the vortex like a localized whirlpool. Veron secured his safety line to a heavy iron stanchion, fighting against the current as he crawled toward the main control console. The water was cold enough to numb his fingers through his thick canvas gloves, making every movement an agonizing struggle against the elements. He could see the great brass key slot just 10 feet away, glowing with a pale, emerald light that signaled its readiness. It was at that exact moment that the shadow detached itself from the surrounding darkness, stepping into the light of the console to reveal the impossible. Veron froze, his breath catching in his throat as he looked upon a perfect duplicate of himself, wearing the same copper suit, bearing the same scars, and holding the same rusted iron shard. The double spoke, his voice an identical match to Veron's own, declaring that the choice had already been made by the ancestors centuries ago. The entity explained that the surface world was not the original home of mankind, but a fragile raft built upon the ruins of a civilization that had drowned itself in arrogance. The double claimed that the rising tide was not a disaster, but a restoration of the true order. The revelation struck Veron with the force of a physical blow, his mind racing to connect the pieces of the puzzle he had seen on the ancient maps. The geometric walls in the canyons, the phantom currents, the faceless monuments, they were not ruins of a forgotten race, but the remains of their own ancestral cities. The identical twin he thought was trapped in the lower chamber was not Kalen at all. Kalen had never descended into the spire. The figure he had seen across the chasm was another mirror image, part of an ancient mechanism designed to test the resolve of the keepers. The true history of the world had been inverted, and the kingdoms above were living on a lie sustained by the stolen energy of the deep ocean. You think you are saving your people, the double mocked, but you are merely prolonging their stagnation at the expense of the planet's heart. The creature stepped closer, the rusted iron shard glinting in the emerald light of the control console as it prepared to strike. Veron realized that to defeat an opponent who knew his every thought and movement, he had to do something completely unpredictable, something that defied logic. He let go of his safety line, allowing the powerful vacuum of the waterfall to sweep him off his feet and drag him toward the swirling vortex. The double lunged forward to grab him, surprised by the suicidal maneuver, and the two identical figures became locked in a frantic struggle amid the rushing waters. They tumbled over the edge of the control platform, falling through the roaring cataract into the lower reservoir where the ancient siphon engine churned. The immense pressure threatened to crush Veron's helmet, but he managed to wedge his boot into a mechanical gear assembly, stopping their descent just above the massive intake blades. Using all his remaining strength, Veron slammed his heavy brass compass into the faceplate of his double, shattering the glass and revealing nothing but swirling black seawater underneath. The entity dissolved into a cloud of dark ink and phantom currents, leaving behind only the rusted iron shard that clattered against the metallic flooring of the reservoir. Pulling himself back up the iron framework of the engine by sheer force of will, Veron reached the primary control console just as the final countdown indicators began to flash red. The water level had reached his chest, and the air inside his suit was growing foul with carbon dioxide as the life support systems failed. He grabbed the main brass key, his hands shaking from exhaustion and hypothermia, and thrust it deep into the central slot of the ancient mechanism. With a final, desperate heave, he turned the key clockwise, feeling the heavy internal tumblers click into place as the ancient machinery roared back to life with a deafening, metallic shriek. The great siphon opened its massive valves, creating a colossal reverse vortex that began to draw the encroaching ocean back down into the deepest subterranean vaults of the earth. The water level in the spire dropped rapidly, exposing the wet, seaweed-draped stone walls and the ancient machinery that had saved the surface world once more. Veron collapsed onto the wet platform, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked out through the observation window at the receding depths. He knew the surface kingdoms were safe for now, but he also knew the terrible truth that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The ocean would return, for it was their true home, and one day the mirror would demand its final balance.